The last Emperor of Yokuda had sunk his tyrannous talons into the western lands, and under his watch, the legendary sword singers were systematically executed. For those few who remained, hope was dwindling fast. Hira's megalomania spread across war-torn Yokuda like a pestilence, and all who did not comply perished. For the last of the Sword Saints, there endured only one chance of salvation, and it brought them to the desert mountains, a parched march across barren badlands, with the full brunt of Hira's brigand army trailing in their wake. The scale of this perilous pursuit was almost beyond comprehension. The singers numbered in the tens of thousands, yet for every one of them, Hira had 30 warriors. The Emperor had recruited orcs, raiders, and any hired killer willing to sully the sanctity of the Sword Saints for a sack of gold. The scouts said Hira had over 1 million men. The war would be cataclysmic, and Yokuda itself would drown from the sheer volume of the bloodshed. The end was nigh. And yet, the prophets of the Way of the Sword did not succumb to despair, for there was one man, one brilliant warrior prince, one Ansei master of the spirit sword, who could turn the destructive deluge upon the tyrant Hira and his million-strong horde of marauders. This man was Frandar do Hunding hel Ansei no Shira. The singers came to him in his secluded cave, and it was Frandar's son, the bard-turned-warrior, Dwemer Hunding, who approached the heroic hermit. It was Dwemer's duty to persuade his father to end his pacifistic solitude, and to take up the Shihai spirit sword once again, and he knew exactly what to say. You see, Dwemer had rejected the Way of the Sword as a young man, and despite the seemingly ceaseless unrest in Yokuda, he had chosen to make music instead of war. That was until the rise of Emperor Hira, who had sent 100 of his best soldiers to arrest the son of the mighty Frandar. Perhaps the tyrant had foreseen his undoing at the hands of these dissidents. Perhaps he merely wished to be the only powerful man in Yokuda. Whatever the case, this proactive measure proved a fatal error for the Emperor. The text titled Dwemer the Singer states, "Being no fool, Hira sent 100 of his best guards, for even an unarmed singer was a very dangerous foe. The luck was that they were able to capture Dwemer and place him in chains, for they came at him as he sat dining with his elderly mother. The disaster was that as he surrendered, they rashly struck the pleading old woman. Too hard it would seem, for she fell dead with that single blow. That single faultless deed, as is often the case in war, was the one pivotal factor causing their eventual defeat. That act ignited in Dwemer the spirit of the Way. Up until that careless stroke, Dwemer was an ordinary artisan. No, an artist, a great artist, but no warrior. The moment of her death, Dwemer rose from his seat, took his chains between his 2 hands, and began swinging the heavy chain in a deadly arc. He slew 4 of the guards, gaining enough space to run and dive through the window and into the river. He disappeared into the night. With one fateful mistake, Hira galvanized father and son against his conquest, the 2 greatest Ansei warriors in all Yokuda. Dwemer climbed Mount Hatu and sought out his father's cave. Frandar Hunding, whose story shall be explored in this video, had retreated from society after an illustrious life as a sword saint. In his 60th year, when he was satisfied that he had achieved invincibility, he turned to philosophy. He developed the Way of the Sword in seclusion, and wrote his widely renowned Book of Circles. Once this was done, he began composing his death poem, so that he could join the Yokudan gods of war in the far shores. Initially, Frandar was unconvinced by the arrival of his son and the plight of the Ansei, for the master was preparing to ascend beyond mortal trivialities. But according to Dwemer the Singer, Dwemer re-entered the cave alone to speak with Hunding. To this day, no one knows what was said, what happened in that cave. Scribes of the time reported bright flashes of light and angry voices. 5 long hours came and went, then both emerged from the cave, Dwemer at Hunding's side. The sword singers had come upon Frandar Hunding on the verge of apotheosis. Like a mind on the brink between waking and dreaming, Frandar possessed wisdom beyond the confines of mortality, yet coherent enough to be processed by mortal minds. and he imparted this wisdom upon the martial ensemble. Those singers became known as the Army of the Circle, and Frandar showed them the way, his strategies, his tactics, and the final great vision for a master stroke. The time had come to plan the conflict between the singers and Hera's horde. They were outnumbered 30-1, so only the most cunning of strategies would suffice. At the foot of the Father of Mountains, Frandar Hunding shared his accumulated wisdom with the tens of thousands of sword singers. Hunding devised a plan of 7 battles, leading the overwhelming force of Hera deeper into the wilderness, and turning back to face them for 6 fleetingly ferocious skirmishes, when the terrain was favourable. And it all culminated with one final fateful battle. The hammer and the anvil, Frandar called it. Mount Hatu was the anvil, and the singers, never faltering from the way, were the hammer. Frandar Hunding was arguably the greatest warrior who ever lived, and this army of sword singers was arguably one of the greatest armies ever to assemble. Even Raimi Ysgramor and his mighty companions would have raised fists of mutual esteem at the valiance of the Western men. Alas, this does not change the reality that these singers were grossly outnumbered, and triumph would not come without sacrifice. Hunding knew that the singers who lived would be few, but Hera and his empire of evil would not live, and so it went. More than 300,000 fell when the hammer struck the anvil. The remnants of Hera's evil army scattered on the 4 winds. But the heroism of the singers was not appreciated in war-torn Yokuda. The populace had grown weary of the endless bloodshed, and to the masses, the singers, despite their honour and their creed, still represented death and destruction. So, Frandar led his followers to the coast, where a flotilla of ships awaited. The singers left their desert home in search of foreign shores. The crux of Yokudan culture left the land and sailed east, chasing the beauty of the dawn. And the gentle citizenry rejoiced, for they saw not the virtue of the singers, but the red that stained their swords and their robes. The singers vowed to learn new ways as they travelled across the great ocean to their new land, to adopt a new name, but to honour the past. In honour of their final battle, they named their new land Hammerfell, and adopted the name Redguards. And so begins the story of the Redguards of Hammerfell. When we think of the Redguards, we think of warriors. We think of curved swords. When we think of Hammerfell, we think of a vast and desolate desert. But these associations are such a disservice to them. In reality, the Redguards have some of the most fascinating lore in the Elder Scrolls. From their gods to their customs, to their unique magic philosophy, to their Japanese-inspired culture. And Hammerfell hosts layer upon layer of interesting civilizations, warring and cross-pollinating. In this video, we're going to explore all these topics, as well as the current political climate in Tamriel, to show why Hammerfell is the perfect location for the Elder Scrolls 6. But in order to do that, I want to return to Yokuda, to complete the Lost Continent's tragic story, and to discover just how this warrior culture came into being. Much like the Sengoku period of Japanese history, in which civil wars and social upheavals took place on an almost constant basis, spanning multiple centuries, Yokuda in the early First Era found itself in a state of perpetual unrest. Prior to this time, the Yokudan people were not known for military prowess. The upper echelons of Yokudan society were reserved for the most prolific artisans, poets and scholars. It is said the nations of Yokuda birthed magnificent advances in metallurgy, agriculture, and shipbuilding, unknown even in the modern times. So, when the ever-evolving domestic strife showed no signs of coming to an end, the way of the sword became inevitable. But as artists, the Yokudans were never going to wield weapons like brutes. They admired the handiwork it took to forge a beautiful balanced blade. They relished in the shrill whistle of a blade cutting the air, the ring of clashing swords, and the rasp of their honed edges, sparks streaking from their friction. The way of the sword was not only an answer to their prayers, it was also a physical outlet for their boundless creativity. In this time, emperors flourished only to be cut down. It became as commonplace as the budding of flowers in spring and the harvest of crops in autumn. Seasons changed, and so did regimes. All the while, the singers pondered the way of the sword, and many legendary warrior philosophers emerged. The greatest among these were known as the Ansei, the Saints of the Sword. And what separated the Ansei from the other singers was the ability to manifest a sword from their very soul. This ethereal blade was called a Shihai, a spirit sword. By seeking enlightenment during such tumultuous times, the saints and singers were challenged to find a balance between the exertion of power and the exercise of restraint. They understood that the ability to do good increased in congruence with the ability to do harm. They communed with lesser-known gods of war, such as Onsi and Leki and Diagna, gods we will speak more of soon. They built halls of the virtues of war to train newcomers to the way, and from these divergent gods and customs, and with the weight of great power and wisdom, the singers developed into a martial culture unlike any other on Nirn. The philosophical nature of the way meant that singers interpreted their roles in society in a variety of ways. Some of the Ansei backed their virtue with actions, wandering the countryside in search of those in need of protection. Others concluded that wielding a blade was inherently destructive, and kept their swords sheathed for the duration of their lives. For these Ansei, their spirit swords took the form of things completely unlike swords. After all, the Shihai is a manifestation of the soul, and it would be foolish to confine such a marvellous expression of the self to one shape. In the case of Frandar Hunding, his exquisite swordsmanship meant that he would always be drawn back to battle in times of great need. But it was his decision alone whether any circumstance warranted his intervention, for the ability to single-handedly dictate the outcome of consequential conflicts was not to be taken lightly. For Hunding, mastery was not some final destination. A line from the Book of Circles reads, "In the season of life in which I passed through the rain's hand, more than 90 duels did I face to prove myself invincible. I learned the 38 grips, the 750 offensive and 1,800 defensive stances, and the 9,000 strikes that I would practice for all my future days. In the season of life in which I marched beneath the sun's height, before the power of the gods did I kneel. I dedicated myself wholly unto the spirit of the sword to forge my Shihai, which I would wield for all my future days. In the season of life in which I was exposed to the hearth's fire, into deep contemplation did I withdraw to ponder the nature of truth. I sharpened my mind as my blade, and defined the principles I would honour for all my future days." He had proven himself to be the greatest warrior in the land, but the next step in his spiritual journey required him to end the pursuit of physical perfection, and to begin the inner search for enlightenment. From the Book of Circles, the sword is the self, its edge is the mind. And since the preeminent sword saint had turned his attention to matters beyond the bounds of the mortal realm, I'd like to do the same, shifting focus to the gods that separate the Yokudans from the other races of Tamriel. Even though it wasn't utilised as much as I would have liked, we saw in Skyrim the stark differences between the cosmopolitan imperial pantheon of the Divines and the animal totem gods of the Atmorans. Sovngarde, Shor's Throne, the ancient Nordic carvings. They were fascinating to discover because they gave the Nords such a unique identity. If the Elder Scrolls 6 is predominantly set in Hammerfell, which it almost certainly will be, we can expect a similar degree of awe when encountering their gods. Of course, parts of Hammerfell are influenced by the Empire, just like Skyrim, but there are huge chunks of Hammerfell where traditional Yokudan gods are venerated, and traditional Yokudan customs are adhered to. Let's have a look at some of those lesser-known deities. According to the monomyth, the Yokudan creation myth shares some similarities to those of other races, with similar spirits fulfilling similar roles, only using different names. The Yokudan myth is named after Satakal, the World Skin, who serves as the cosmic embodiment of the Kalpic cycle. Much like the Ouroboros of ancient Egypt and Greece, Satakal is the self-devouring serpent. The snake forms a circle, the head is the birth of the world, the body is its life, and the tail its death. And where the head meets and eats the tail, that is where beginning and end coalesce, and the cycle begins anew. The monomyth states, Satak was first serpent, the snake who came before, and all the worlds to come rested in the glimmer of its scales. But it was so big there was nothing but, and thus it was coiled around and around itself, and the worlds to come slid across each other, but none had room to breathe or even be. And so, the worlds called to something to save them, to let them out. But of course, there was nothing outside the first serpent. So aid had to come from inside it. This was Akel, the hungry stomach. Thus, the cycle of consumption commenced, and it was a violent time. The spirits of the world were confused. They tried to develop some sense of self, some purpose in this thing that wasn't void. But their progress was always reset by the snake's ruinous hunger. Eventually, the strongest spirits learned to recognize the pattern, and found a way to bypass the cycle by moving at strange angles. Ruptka, also known as Tulpapa, led the spirits on this pilgrimage, called the Walkabout, and they took names and strode between the world skins without being devoured. Ruptka arranged the stars in the sky so that the weaker spirits could find their way to safety, and this haven became known as the Far Shores. Tulpapa then made himself a helper from the detritus of past skins, and named it Sep. Sep, the second serpent, has a lot in common with Shor Lorcan, for he had much of the hungry stomach inside him. Sep was corrupted by the hunger, and gathered the rest of the old skins and balled them up, tricking spirits to help him, promising them this was how you reached the new world, by making one out of the old. And like Lorcan, Sep had tricked the original spirits into devoting their limitless power to something limited, and they were gravely weakened. The spirits that were left pleaded with Tulpapa to take them back, but Grim Ruptka would not, and he told the spirits that they must learn new ways to follow the stars to the far shores now. If they could not, then they must live on through their children, which was not the same as before. Sep, however, needed more punishment, and so Tulpapa squashed the snake with a big stick. The hunger fell out of Sep's dead mouth, and was the only thing left of the second serpent. While the rest of the new world was allowed to strive back to godhood, Sep could only slink around in a dead skin, or swim about in the sky, a hungry void that jealously tried to eat the stars. Ruptka served a similar purpose to Anwiel, and Sep was like Sifis. I have no doubt that many of Frandar Hunding's ruminations within his cave were related to the Walkabout and the Far Shores, where there is no hunger, thirst or fatigue, but there are enough glorious challenges to keep a warrior spirit engaged forever. So, we have Ruptka and Sep, but there are plenty more. I mentioned Onsi, Leki and Diagna, the warrior gods. Onsi is the god of war, the bone shaver, and he taught the Yokudans how to pull their knives into swords. Frandar Hunding gave praise to Onsi when speaking on the forging of blades, and on the mastery of grips, stances and discipline. Leki is the goddess of aberrant swordsmanship. When the ancient Yokudans warred with the left-handed elves, the two races were evenly matched. Thus it fell to Leki and her lateral wisdom to provide the men with new techniques, like the ephemeral feint. And these techniques gave the Yokudans the edge, and ultimately the victory. Diagna was the Orichalc god of the sideways blade, and he provided the Yokudans with weapons forged from Orichalcum. Diagna was actually an ascended avatar of the Hunding, who is arguably the most crucial of the Yokudan gods, so we'll come to him last. There are some deities who clearly parallel those of the better-known pantheons, like Tuwaka, Morwa, Zet and Tava. Tuwaka is the caretaker of the Far Shores, and guides souls to the afterlife. Morwa is the Yokudan fertility goddess, and she is always portrayed with 4 arms, so that she can grab more husbands. Zet is the god of agriculture, law and mathematics, and is therefore an important god in the maintenance of a fair and functioning society. Tava is the bird spirit of the air, and is crucial in guiding the Yokudans on hazardous voyages, and in times of existential danger. She guides them on exoduses to new lands. Her role cannot be understated in the salvation of the Yokudans after the cataclysm that would inevitably unfold in the next part of this tale. But along with Tava we have Hunding, the make-way god. Hunding represents triumph over adversity, perseverance against infidels, and like Shazar and the Shezarines, the Hunding manifests as a Yokudan mortal whenever they need to make way. As I'm sure you've noticed, the way is a fundamental concept in Yokudan belief. Diagna was an avatar of the Hunding, and many would claim that Frandar Hunding was too, for he guided the survivors of the War of the Singers to the new frontier. Frandar Hunding led the first Gada, or warrior wave, to Tamriel. But many more would follow, for despite Hera's defeat between the hammer and the anvil, the war was not quite over. The text titled The Hunger of Sep states, "Then evil came to Yokuda, and red war, and forbidden rites were practiced, and fell things were summoned that should never have been called forth. It was a time of ending. Satakal arose from the starry deeps, and Yokuda was pulled down beneath the waves." But how could this happen when the scourge that was Hera's brigand army was supposedly vanquished? Some say it was merely a series of earthquakes, but the wide-scale destruction seemed beyond anything natural. Around 12 years after Hunding made way to Hammerfell, there was one final civil war. We know that Emperor Hera made a concerted effort to wipe out the art of sword singing in Yokuda, and there is no explicit mention of his death in the War of the Singers. So, what if Emperor Hera was still alive, and was trying to re-establish his drive to purge the way of the sword from Yokuda? There must have been many who did not follow Hunding east after all. Or even if Hera was dead, perhaps his sympathizers regrouped and sought retribution for their leader's defeat. The Pocket Guide to the Empire 3rd edition mentions a renegade band of Ansei named the Hera Dirge. A dirge is a kind of lament, a funeral rite for someone who's passed. The guide says that the Hera Dirge were masters of stone magic, and when they were defeated in battle in First Era 792, the argument goes they had their revenge on the entire land, destroying what they would never rule. But how? The Ansei were remarkable fighters, but could they demolish an entire continent? Well, there has long been a non-canon theory that a select few masters of the Ansei discovered a technique called the Pancrato Sword. Michael Kirkbride speaks of it in detail in his text, Lord Vivek's Meeting with Cyrus the Redguard. In the text, the Pancrato Sword is said to be forbidden. When Cyrus threatens to unleash the Pancrato Sword, Vivek says, "Cut the Atomos and you die too." Cutting the Atomos suggests that this technique involved nuclear fission, splitting atoms. The Pancrato Sword is an atom bomb. It would be easy to dismiss this as one of Kirkbride's more eccentric ideas, swiftly swatted away by Todd Howard. But since Kirkbride's departure from Bethesda, multiple in-game sources have essentially confirmed the theory. First, the Celestial Warrior, the physical manifestation of the warrior constellation, states, "The Shihai of a first-rank Ansei sank Yokuda." And then there's Rada al-Saran, a Yokudan who sought out the curse of vampirism so that he could perfect his Shihai as an immortal. He says, "Shall I show you the cut that sundered Yokuda?" With these supporting quotes, it's hard to argue the validity of the Pancrato Sword. And it's a testament to the unfathomable power of those Ansei who devoted their lives to the way of the sword, and their own individual paths to enlightenment. The Redguards are often called Tamriel's finest warriors, but that is one hell of an understatement. The Redguards sprouted from philosophical, artistic roots. Becoming great warriors was merely an offshoot of these origins. It would be like calling Socrates a pretty thoughtful guy. According to Plato, Socrates even fought in the Peloponnesian Wars, making him something of a warrior himself. Whatever the case, a great cataclysm sank Yokuda into the sea, or at least raised it to rubble and ruin. And the Yokudans, in their Gada warrior waves, found a new home in the deserts of Tamriel's west, and so began their part in the story of Dawn's beauty. The Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition gives an account of the Redguard arrival. The bulk of these refugees landed at the uninhabited Isle of Herne, while the rest continued on to the mainland. This vanguard warrior wave of Yokudans, the Gada, swept into the country, quickly slaughtering and enslaving the beast folk and Nedic villagers before them, bloodily paving the way for their people who waited at Herne, including the Nutatambu, their kings and ruling bodies. Back in Yokuda, when tyranny wasn't rearing its ugly head, the continent was governed by a ruling body of kings called the Nutatambu, each with their own land and interests. But before the former rulers of Yokuda could lay claim to the new frontier of Hammerfell, the warriors needed to deal with a vast array of threats. You see, Hammerfell, or Vollenfell as the local Dwemer would have called it, was rather unfortunately already occupied when the Yokudans arrived. Alas, the Yokudans did what all great nations do when they migrate to foreign soil. They made war with the natives, and with any other peoples who had found the place first. Prior to the Yokudan arrival, Hammerfell was occupied by a tribe of star-worshipping Nedes called the Duraki, who aptly named the region the Deathlands. The Dwemer clan Rorken, who famously migrated to what they call Vollenfell, when the Rorken chieftain tossed his hammer Vollendrung across Tamriel from his former home of Resdain. There were also orcs and goblins all over the desert province, and even rumours of some Bretons and Elves, likely remnants of the Durrani Empire, which had faded into obscurity a few centuries earlier. Of these groups, the Rorken dwarves would likely have been the greatest threat to Yokudan conquest. But fortunately for the Redguards, the Dwemer disappeared around 92 years before, in First Era 700. While we often think of the Nedic humans as being slaves to elves, the Duraki Nedes were actually never conquered by the Durrani, or even the Ayleids. On such familiar soil, they would have given the Redguards quite the challenge. But fortune favoured the bold foreign warriors, and treachery unravelled the prosperous tribe, destabilising the Duraki just as the Gada crossed their borders. Ultimately, the fragmented and betrayed Duraki people were conquered by the Yokudan invaders. Surprisingly, the most significant danger to the Gada migration was the Goblin menace. When Frandar, Daivad and the first Swordsingers established a foothold in Hammerfell, they encountered giant goblins. The most fearsome among them belonged to the Flint-Tooth tribe. According to Thronekeeper Farvad, Frandar Hunding rallied the swords of the Gada to slay the beasts. But these green savages were brutal and powerful, and Farvad says, Tuwaka claimed him during one of the bloodiest battles of the campaign. But his son Daivad, filled with wrath over the slaying of his father, soon rose to take command of the Gada. He swore to avenge his father, no matter the cost. The most legendary swordsman in the West had fallen on the brink of securing this new frontier for his people. But Daivad completed his father's task and brought honour to the Hunding name. The Song of Daivad tells us that he and his band of sword singers worked their sacred forges and consulted eldritch tomes for many long years to create 5 great swords. With these blessed blades, the Gada forever vanquished the giant goblins. Frandar Hunding might have fallen, but his legacy would live on through the Book of Circles, and it became codified in Redguard custom to keep a copy of the tome in an alcove by the hearth of every home. The Way of the Sword had been crucial in securing this new frontier for the Yokudans, but the new Redguards of Hammerfell soon, over a few generations, lost touch with the Way, and with the art of singing entirely. The populace were focused on settling into their new homeland, establishing a secure and prosperous nation. But conflict soon arose between those Redguards who sought to uphold their ancient traditions, and those who wished to adapt to this new environment and the new political climate. In Yokuda they might have dominated the entire continent, but here they were going to have to deal with a variety of unfamiliar external powers, with men, mer and beasts. According to the text, the Nutatambu of Yokuda, as the decades passed, the influence of the Nutatambu faded, and Redguard society split into 2 primary cultural factions. The Forebears, generally considered the more adaptable of the 2, opened trade with former enemies and maintained the coastal ports. Inland, the Crown still held much of the power, and strongly adhered to the ancient Yokudan tenets. Despite this fanatical veneration, much Yokudan knowledge was lost to time and feuds between the factions. The eldest Crown scholars scathingly chide the modern Redguards as mere cultural shadows of their ancestors. The most controversial part of this split was the Forebear decision to adopt the gods of their neighbouring Bretons and Imperials. They kept some of the old gods, those who had parallels in the divines, like Tava, Morwa and Tuwaka, but the Crown Redguards admonished their misguided kin for neglecting or outright forgetting gods like Ruptga, Onsi and Diagna, gods who had been vital in preserving the Yokudan people, allowing them to endure so much hardship over the centuries. The Crowns value history and venerate the legacy of their ancestors, but this was not Yokuda. Ironically, the more progressive Forebears are the ones who descended from the Regada, because those warriors on the front lines were exposed to a plethora of diverse peoples and cultures. The Crowns, on the other hand, descended from the remnants of the Yokudan ruling class, so you can understand why they would be hesitant to relinquish control of their wealth and power. But the Forebears understood that when adversarial powers encroached on Hammerfell, like that of Riemann's Second Empire, they would either have to perpetually fight for their survival, as it was during the centuries of civil war that sundered Yokuda, or they could consider diplomacy and capitulate on some of their old ideals. It would require sacrifice, but perhaps it would benefit the Crowns as well, allowing the Redguards to focus more of their efforts on advancing their civilization, and perhaps even returning to their artistic, academic culture. Alas, the two parties remained divided, and civil wars were as abundant in Hammerfell as they were in Yokuda. When they were not warring amongst themselves, the Redguards were dealing with the Orcs of Orsinium, the Bretons of High Rock, and multiple Cyrodiilic empires. And in the throes of all this turmoil, the honourable art of sword singing and adherence to the way of the sword simply faded away. It wasn't outlawed, there were no pogroms like old emperor eras. The ancient art just slipped away slowly, carried like grains of sand on the wind, until it was lost in the dunes. The Redguards maintained their martial prowess, and were still considered by many to be Tamriel's finest warriors. But there was certainly a yearning in the hearts of many a Redguard for a lost art, an art that brought them closer to understanding the nature of the universe and their role in it. There were some who tried to revive the art, like the gallant swordmaster Sai Sahan, but despite his virtuous and dutiful nature, the endeavour proved hopeless. And as we approach contemporary history, in the decades preceding the rise of the last Dragonborn in 4th Era 201, the need for a return to the way of the sword could not be more providential. The political climate following the events of the Elder Scrolls V means that Hammerfell is well and truly in the spotlight. It is the pivotal province that could shape the future of Tamriel for better or for worse. I'll paraphrase a bit from here, as I do have an in-depth video on the topic already on the channel. I'll leave a link to it in the description for anyone craving a deeper dive. But in the wake of the Great War, the Empire was left in a precarious position. The terms of the White Gold Concordat forced the Imperials to make concessions that were particularly objectionable for the Nords and the Redguards. And the Aldmeri Dominion got exactly what they wanted. Skyrim was plunged into civil war, and Hammerfell ceded from the Empire. For the Thalmor, it was a strategy of divide and conquer. Now, I believe the Thalmor have a hidden motive, one that involves the unmaking of the very foundations of Nirn. In order to achieve this insidious ambition, they need to take control of the Adamantine Tower in the Iliac Bay. In order to achieve this, they need a successful campaign in Hammerfell. But the Dominion was not prepared for just how well the spirited Redguards would defend their homeland, even while their forces were spread out, fighting in support of Cyrodiil. When the war initially began, the Aldmeri Dominion stormed through Hammerfell in what can only be described as an indomitable blitzkrieg. Under the leadership of Lady Aranelia, the Dominion forces invaded Hammerfell from Cyrodiil in the east, while simultaneously landing an assault on the southern shores. As stated in Justianus Quintius's account of the Great War, the disunited Redguard forces offered only scattered resistance to the invaders, and much of the southern coastline was quickly overrun. The greatly outnumbered Imperial legions retreated across the Alakir Desert in the now famous March of First. In Hammerfell, the Thalmor were content to consolidate their gains as they took control of the whole southern coastline, which was in fact their stated objective in the ultimatum delivered to the Emperor. Of the southern cities, only Higath still held out. The survivors of the March of First regrouped in northern Hammerfell, joined by reinforcements from High Rock. It's quite possible that Hammerfell would have fallen entirely, were it not for the unlikeliest of alliances. There was a reconciliation between historic rivals, Crown and Forebear. A Forebear army broke the siege of Higath, which was a Crown city. The text proceeds to say, in Hammerfell, General Decianus was preparing to drive the Aldmeri back from Skaven when he was ordered to march for Cyrodiil. Unwilling to abandon Hammerfell completely, he allowed a great number of invalids to be discharged from the legions before they marched east. These veterans formed the core of the army that eventually drove Lady Aranelia's forces back across the Alakir late in 174, taking heavy losses on their retreat from harassing attacks by the Alakir warriors. Despite victory in Cyrodiil, the Concordat was signed, and a large chunk of southern Hammerfell was ceded to the Dominion, but Hammerfell refused to submit. In the end, the heroic Redguards fought the Aldmeri Dominion to a standstill, although the war lasted for 5 more years and left southern Hammerfell devastated. Hammerfell and the Dominion signed the Second Treaty of Strosmakai, and the Elves withdrew from the province. But as we all know, the Dominion would not be appeased for long. The Thalmor would be back to subdue the Redguards, to secure their rear before marching on Tower Zero, Adamantia. It could well be that the Redguards will be at the vanguard fighting for the survival of Tamriel, and I couldn't have picked better candidates for such a severe mission. The Redguards have an illustrious history of great sword hands, and even greater minds. They dwell in a province with the footprints of a diverse range of unique cultures, from Dwemer to stargazing Nedes, to orcs and goblins, even some Nordic, Breton and Elven influences. The terrain varies from arid desert to soaring mountain ranges. There are tropical islands and magical cities, and that's not to mention the distinct Yokudan architecture, heavily ornamented and intricately engraved, with golden domes polished like small suns. Hammerfell is a province worth fighting for, and if the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place here, the time is ripe for a hero to rise, potentially even to revive the long-lost art of sword singing. The way of the sword is a martial philosophy, but ultimately it's a means of achieving a higher spiritual state. Such metaphysical pursuits are not limited to the blade, and a Shihai can take any shape. It could be a book of knowledge, a musical instrument, an omnicolour shawl, perhaps even a song. It is but an incarnation of the soul, and with all this in mind, from the beginnings of documented Yokudan history, through many centuries of toil and multiple existential perils, I believe the Elder Scrolls 6 is the perfect time to finally explore Hammerfell in full, the home of the warrior philosophers. And there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the Redguards, and I hope this video has given you more reasons to be excited about an Elder Scrolls 6 set in Hammerfell, which it almost certainly will be. Thanks so much for watching. Links to my socials and to my Patreon can be found below, but as always, please only consider pledging if you can comfortably afford to, and really want to show your support for the channel. My name is Drew, you've been watching Drewmora, and I'll see you in the next one.